extraterrestrial snowmen, an expedition to the North Pole, Santa's dark counterpart, and cultists worshipping a Lovecraftian blood god. What do they all have in common? Christmas! Hey guys, welcome back to the 2023 ParasykeTV Holiday Special, where today we'll be doing something just a little bit different, talking about and analyzing one of the best internet horror stories based around the holiday season. Now, I will be changing the title just a little bit to avoid a major spoiler, but I will be linking the full story and the author Christian Wallis' X profile in the description below. Now let's get into the story. I'm an Arctic explorer, and I found something. Our story opens up with our group of intrepid explorers setting up camp in the wastelands of the Arctic near the North Pole. The group come from various backgrounds, but the expedition is based all around David, our protagonist's idea that a long-lost ship, the Pinafore, was trapped in the ice somewhere in the region. And he was right. The Pinafore, an 80-foot-long European caravel, had left the shore in 1543 and disappeared without a trace, along with its entire crew. After a brutal 7-day hike, David and his team confirmed that the ship was indeed frozen in the ice, and they began to set up camp about 300 yards away from the ghost ship. The team was made up of David, who had been obsessing over finding the ship for over a decade, even building a scale model of it in his living room. Maggie, a meteorologist who was coordinating a drone supply route from base camp, providing them with the rest of the supplies and equipment they would need now that they had located the lost ship. Sebastian, the team's guide, was basically Bear Grylls and found nothing but satisfaction in the challenge of the harsh conditions the Arctic offered. And Craig, one of David's colleagues from the university, who had an almost equally strong obsession as David with finding the Pinafore. With the ghost ship looming over their nearby camp, frozen in time, looking like black volcanic rock encased in glittering ice, David and Maggie try to cut a vague tension they're both feeling, joking with each other that Sebastian, their guide, must be beside himself now that their brutal trek across the Arctic wilderness was finally over, and they'd now be stuck in one spot for the time being. When Maggie casually drops an exciting and important development about their expedition. They had just received the full results of satellite scans of the area. The ice surrounding the Pinafore was completely safe and over a mile thick, but that wasn't all. The Pinafore, this long-lost ship that was the reason behind the whole expedition, wasn't the only anomaly the satellites picked up in the ice. There was something else, a day's hike to the north, something hard, hollow. Maggie describing it as an intriguing and odd finding. Although it did pique David's interest, they had also just received clearance from base camp that now that they knew the ice was thick enough and safe enough to traverse, he could now explore the long-lost ship he had been obsessing over for over a decade. A ship no one had stepped foot on for over 400 years. They were going to explore the ship, and Sebastian could make the day's hike over to the second anomaly if he really wanted to. Yeah, there's 4 of you alone in the Arctic, miles away from base camp. One of you should totally split off and go do something by himself. Yeah, split up. See what happens. As the team hunkered down in their tents for the blistering cold night, David just tossed and turned. He had been basically vibrating from excitement ever since they caught the first glimpse of the ship's mast from miles away. He knew he had absolutely zero chance of getting any sleep that night. So he made a questionable decision, quietly retrieved a flashlight, made sure no one else from his camp stirred awake, and began the few hundred-yard trek from the camp to the icy, forsaken ship. Not wanting to alert his team and wake them up, he kept his flashlight off, but the darkness of the Arctic night was so black that he began to feel blind, like his eyes just couldn't adjust to the darkness enough to distinguish the ship's form. Starting to panic, thinking he might have gotten lost somehow, he flicked the flashlight on, dumbstruck in awe of the ship just a few feet away from him, almost close enough to touch. He almost felt as though the groaning of the ice beneath his feet was emanating from the ship somehow, and not from the weather, like it was some great nautical beast crying out for him. David reached out for a ladder on the side of the ship, testing his weight against it, and to his amazement, it held. I clumsily forced my way overboard and collapsed onto the deck, shouting my laughter into the blizzard. He made a slow and deliberate circle around the deck, amazed at how well every inch of it had been preserved by the ice. and almost without conscious thought, he began tugging at the trap door that led below deck. It wasn't easy, taking him what felt like hours just to get the thing to budge. It also wasn't lost on him that going slower in the daylight with his team by his side, utilizing all the tools and equipment they brought, would probably work better for preservation's sake. But he couldn't stop himself. He had to know what secrets the Pinafore held after all this time. When the door finally slammed open, landing on the deck with a terrible thunderclap, it revealed a set of steps descending into total darkness. What he saw shocked him. Rigging of the ship had been snapped, the beams and masts broken and gouged, the wood splintered, and all of a sudden he felt as though he was walking into a tomb. He took one last look at the starlit deck before descending into the ship's belly. Stairs led to a small hold with a single corridor leading up the floor of the ship, where he knew from his extensive research he'd find the captain's quarters. His intention was to head directly to the captain's quarters and read the captain's log, ignoring all the little details along the way, though no person in their right mind would be able to ignore what he would soon discover. I'll read this paragraph exactly as Christian wrote it, as I don't think just explaining it would do it justice. I screamed when I first saw the head. It was a gaunt, eyeless, leathery thing, twisted into a frozen grin of pain. A gnarled hand reached out towards me, and I let out another shriek and fell backwards, sending the torch spinning out where it finally settled on the monstrosity before me. The scream died as I realized slowly that the thing was not moving, and it wasn't a single thing. A dozen heads lay crammed together, arms and fingerless hands shoved out in awkward angles, as if they were desperately groping for something that lay just out of reach. It was a pile of bodies, their limbs and torsos interwoven in a bone-breaking display of torture and mutilation. From how David describes what he is seeing, it sounds like most of, if not all of the crew of the Pinafore were killed, then had their bodies broken and molded into some kind of bizarre effigy, frozen and preserved almost perfectly for hundreds of years. One of the more disturbing details, in my opinion, is that David describes the hands as being mostly fingerless. So either something removed their fingers or they survived long enough to lose their fingers to frostbite. David, facing this incredible terror, frantically grabbed at his flashlight and began retreating back towards the trapdoor that led to this nightmare. But just as he had almost reached the steps back to the trapdoor, it slammed shut, causing him to scream in horror. The team had already woken up and become aware that David was missing from camp when they heard this blood-curdling scream in the distance. Now all of them were back at camp, and David was completely shaken. Craig lightly chastised him as he sat under a foil blanket with a cup of hot chocolate and brandy to warm up and try to calm down. Couldn't have woken me? I would have given anything to be there with you. As Sebastian stepped back onto the ice off of the ship, Craig hurried to satisfy his intense curiosity. Sebastian, uncharacteristically quiet and almost as shaken as David was, offered him an apology after seeing what had caused him to scream. Jesus, no one wants to be locked in the dark with that thing. What is it? David offered an answer, extrapolating that obviously it must be the crew, and cursing the fact that they hadn't brought any medical professionals or biologists to help them figure out what exactly they were looking at. Sebastian asked if Maggie can use drones to bring them some equipment to help them figure it out. Maggie thinks they can take samples and send them back to base camp using drones and maybe even set up a live video feed, but other than that, this was completely out of their wheelhouse. David agrees as Sebastian gives us kind of our first look at what may be going on in the bigger picture, mentioning that the pile of bodies almost reminded him of a macabre Christmas tree. An idea that sent shivers through all three of them. And although this new development was completely disturbing, whatever occurred happened hundreds of years prior, and the team had a job to do. The next morning, Maggie went over these satellite reports with Sebastian, apparently undeterred by the human body parts Christmas tree they had found the night before. They needed to know what this second anomaly to the north of the ship was. Sebastian departed the camp with a few days' supplies, as Craig hung makeshift curtains around the bizarre effigy of frozen flesh and withered bone, so the team could continue work without facing this thing every few seconds. Craig and Maggie took photos of everything and started an inventory of every item they could find, carefully labeling and categorizing each object. As David scoured through the ship trying to find any clue as to what may have led the ship to its final destination. The ship was crewed by a dozen or so men, including a surgeon, a cook, smith, and a cartographer. The ship's surgeon and resident scholar even had his own collection of shells carefully labeled. The research team found faded, broken letters that spoke of mothers and wives, figures sculpted from whalebone, and ancient bottles of homebrewed spirits stashed away under pillows. They also noticed suspicious dark stains on some of the walls and floors, and a blade embedded into one of the doors. But for some reason, maybe due to the isolation and gravity of the situation that they're in kind of settling in, they tried to ignore the implication of violence. Again, human body parts Christmas tree, that's something that's happened. That happened. So I don't think we need to be talking about the implication of violence because violence confirmed. David takes note that the captain's chamber struck him as odd. He thinks that the ship must have disappeared around Christmas time because I needed it to because this is a Christmas video. Wait, no, that's not right. He thinks the ship disappeared around Christmas time because there is a sprig of holly nailed to the ceiling in the captain's quarters. However, the captain's desk was smashed in half. There was rope and twine all over the place, and there were drag marks in the floor and fingernails scattered around them. A musket under the desk that had been fired, and a solitary, half-gnawed human finger, again preserved by the deep cold. Interestingly, in the doctor's quarters, the medical cabinets that would usually be stocked were completely devoid of all of their ointments and tinctures that would be used at the time to treat pain and infection, though the doctor's logs contained no entries pertaining to any infections, sickness, or injuries. There was a lifetime of work, and the details we captured guaranteed more funding than I could have ever imagined. We had our ghost ship, we had our thrilling and creepy details, and we had one great big inexplicable pile of corpses that would boggle some of the greatest researchers at the university. It was a little scary, but otherwise, this was good news. So I gotta stop for a second and just point out that it's stuff like that last paragraph that for me sets this story and stories like this apart from so many of the other creepypasta and no sleep. And specifically in this case, you may be wondering what about this paragraph I think sets it apart. Well, there's just a perfect amount of character development and motive laid out. These people have just found something so horrifically disturbing that in a lot of stories it would kind of be immersion breaking. Like, why would you stick around? Why would you not only stick around, but spend so much time in the ship cataloging everything and researching when you have this pile of dead bodies perfectly preserved in there? But this paragraph sums it up perfectly with just one word: funding. Yes, the human Christmas tree was very disturbing to the team, but David just sees it as a thrilling and creepy detail that would interest academia and the public and more than likely secure his team all the funding they would ever need. It just makes it way more believable for me, and it's minor details like this that just absolutely lock me into an internet horror story. As the team scoured the ship for new discoveries, Sebastian made his way north towards the second anomaly, checking in over the radio for the first 12 hours before going silent. David, Maggie, and Craig were experiencing some inclement weather in and around the ship, so at first they were able to just chalk it up to radio interference. But now, a full 24 hours has gone by since they've heard from Sebastian, and the radio silence was becoming impossible to ignore or excuse. When the research team woke up that next day, they were beyond making innocent excuses as to what could be interrupting Sebastian's normal check-ins. They were worried now. After finding a giant pile of dead bodies, I'd be worried too. So they once again tried to hail Sebastian over the radio, but this time they got an answer. A discordant series of clicks and heavy breathing. Maggie immediately called out, "Sebastian, is that you? Are you okay?" But the team was met with only the strange hiss of Sebastian's radio, broken up by the occasional sharp breath or dragging noise. The team tried desperately to get Sebastian to say something over the radio for the next few hours, until finally his radio ceased to return any signal whatsoever. Craig mused that either Sebastian was dead, or that he had for some reason turned off his radio to ignore them. Come on, Craig. Former clearly being the much more probable answer. Something about these strange noises made the team feel even more nervous. Maggie suggested that maybe he just wasn't thinking about the radio and had been activating it by accident when it was in his pocket, and they were just hearing him hiking. But they agreed the breathing felt close and ragged, almost animalistic, like a man quickly approaching death. But they still agreed to wait just a little longer. They contacted base camp and let them know that for all intents and purposes, Sebastian was missing. The base camp took note and the team continued working on the ship for the rest of the day. When they got back to camp, HQ basically let them know that they had sent drones flying over the second anomaly and the span of tundra in between the second anomaly and the shipwreck, and they saw no signs of Sebastian or anything else. There's a minor detail here about the HQ sending drones to the second anomaly that I just want you to keep in mind until all the way at the end of the video. Finally, a full 48 hours after Sebastian's last successful transmission, Craig, Maggie, and David decided that they would take off and look for Sebastian themselves. Always eager to push himself as far as he could, Sebastian left for the second anomaly on foot, but the team took off on snowmobiles on what they believed would be a 4 to 6 hour ride through the Arctic tundra. Hours later, the team reached the GPS ping, where the satellite had picked up something in the snow. At first, David worried that they may have gotten lost, as the only thing around for miles was a snowbank. But Craig called out, "That a door?" Maggie called out in agreement. She was on her hands and knees inspecting a door that was no more than 4 feet tall, embedded in the icy wall of the snowbank. David approached in almost a dreamlike wonder of what he was seeing, rubbing away the snow and ice, revealing a door frame and wall that was made of extremely thick, ancient wood. Craig thought aloud, utterly confused. Who would put a door here? It goes deeper, Maggie said, her hands cupped around her face as she peered through a small window embedded into the door. She was looking at stairs descending into the darkness. Already knowing the answer to his question, but wanting so badly for either one of his peers to give in to their fear, David asked, "Are we sure Sebastian was here?" But to David's absolute disappointment, Maggie struggled and pulled something away from the doorframe, holding it up to the light so David and Craig could both see. A baby blue shred of fabric, unmistakably belonging to Sebastian's outer coat. Craig found something as well. A wooden knife with the blade buried an inch into the wall, the grip bearing the Pinofor's seal. Someone from the ship had made it to the second anomaly. David took the blade in hand, and when he looked down at it, he noticed a faint rust brown spattering along the blade. The three confirmed the GPS location with base camp, and after some effort finally loosened the small door, swinging open slowly with a spine-tingling squeal. The structure obviously seemed like many other man-made structures, save for a few minor details. The roof was so low the explorers had to hunch over just to fit inside, and the beams lining the ceiling were just rough-hewn tree trunks with the bark still visible on them. Appearing almost like Viking construction, something you'd see in the Canadian or Nordic wilderness, Maggie noticed some strange runes stitched across the doorway. The room itself was a good 20 by 20 meters, with worktop tables spanning along 3 of the walls. Maggie shuffled over and picked up a stool that had been neatly tucked under one of the worktops, holding it up to David, showing it to be no bigger than his forearm. Before they could get Craig's attention to show him the oddity, he was calling for theirs, showing them a small wooden object he held in his hands. It was a hedgehog, or at least a carving of one, with little wheels instead of legs so it could be rolled along the ground. "It's a toy," Craig cried, laughing at the ridiculousness. "Is this some kind of prank, Dave? Is this some kind of up PR stunt by the university? Because if it is, I'm not going to be happy." "I don't know what this is," David said. "I'm not in on it. And if either of you are, I'd appreciate you saying it now." Maggie retrieved something disturbing from one of the dark corners of the room, one of Sebastian's shoes, the fabric torn and spattered with blood. David sturdied himself and faced his colleagues. "We should work on the assumption that Sebastian needs our help. And if this is a joke, we can kick his ass afterwards." Together they walked towards the nearby stairs. Footprints were still visible in the thin layer of snow that had drifted into the building over the years. They knew that if Sebastian was still nearby, then he must be below. On the next level down, Craig once again picked up a trinket, bringing it close to his face as he studied it. He hadn't seen this before, whatever this material was. The item seemed to be some kind of crude toy, but the material that covered the toy was this velvety sort of leather that remained soft despite the ice-cold temperatures. As he turned it over in his hand, he and David both noticed a faded blue patch. Craig continued squinting at it, analyzing it, as David gently made contact with his wrist, as though gesturing that he should put it down. "What is it?" he asked in sort of a subtle defiance to David's physical suggestion. David replied, "It's Erasmus, the patron saint of sailors. Now put it down." "Why would someone paint that on a toy?" Craig replied. "They wouldn't. They almost certainly would have tattooed it on the arm of a 16th century sailor." Disgusted, Craig flinched and abruptly dropped the relic. A pound of flesh, most likely taken by someone or something as some kind of morbid keepsake from one of the sailors aboard the Pinafore. "That's not all. I think this is bone," Maggie said, as she held up a small carving of the baby Jesus, no larger than the size of one of their thumbs and made of some kind of yellowing ivory. David, still desperately huffing copium, suggested that many Arctic cultures make carvings out of seal bone. "How many of them make toys in a workshop built for hobbits? Am I the only one who wants to pin the tail on the donkey and make the connection here?" Craig cried. David pondered. Maybe it could be some old European colony, religious fanatics trying to recreate the myth. Christian, the author, doesn't elaborate on what exact myth he's talking about here, but I kind of have to imagine at this point the terrified team are all kind of assuming the same thing the audience is beginning to assume. This is starting to look like a macabre version of Santa's workshop. Craig points out that Sebastian's ice pick was embedded in the floor just a few feet away. A few strands of hair still threaded around the blade, along with some coils of rope identical to the kind they found on the Pinafore. At this point, the team descends to another floor deeper within the workshop. The toys had become even more demented, and it's on this floor that the team came upon a Christmas tree, decorated with what looked like withered black prunes and charcoal rope. Quickly realized these were decaying human remains exposed to the cold for centuries. Organs and intestines. One of the ornaments was fresh though, a kidney with steam still rising from it. As they made this horrifying discovery, a pair of eyes glimmered at them from the shadows just beyond the tree. They belonged to a remarkably carved wooden doll, almost lifelike other than the distinct coloration of hardwood, but the eyes were far too human. Craig, once again, unable to curb his curiosity, reached out with his finger, expecting, or rather hoping, to feel the hard texture of polished glass. Instead, the texture was very soft, and a viscous fluid dripped from his finger after he pulled away. These were indeed Sebastian's eyes. Eventually, the team did find what was left of Sebastian, still alive in a way, but nearly on his last breath. He had been cracked open like a turkey and left to air in the freezing cold. His skin and bones were pulled apart with expert precision, his face a pallid mask of terror. He was conscious, but could only wail and cry. Blinded and terrified, he initially tore his hand away when Maggie reached out and took it. He was naked, seconds away from freezing to death, and Craig almost draped his coat over him instinctively, but stopped at the realization it would be resting directly on top of his exposed chest cavity. He was alive for no more than a minute as we crouched there. He didn't speak. No matter how often we asked our desperate and frightened questions, the only sense we got of what he was going through was the relief that passed over his face when he finally died, as if he had awoken at last from a terrible nightmare and was finally free of that terror. The team shared an outburst of shock, horror, and tears. Maggie wondered if some lunatic or demented serial killer with some kind of Christmas fixation had settled there. David reminded them both of the sailors, the knife they had found there, the toys made from their remains. "So what are we saying exactly? Santa's elves went off the straight and narrow? What does any of this even mean?" Maggie cut Craig off, insisting that none of that even mattered right now. They needed to focus on getting out of there and getting Sebastian back to base camp. But recovering what was left of Sebastian wasn't really an option. David breaking it down to Maggie that they wouldn't be helping him or themselves by hauling his lifeless body up 4 floors and across 15 miles of open tundra. So they left. A few hours later, the team was back at their camp. All of them just wanted to feel secure, although the thin walls of their tents offered little protection against the elements, not to mention whatever else was lurking out there. They had fortunately made it back to camp just as the sun was starting to set. David, Maggie, and Craig dreaded nightfall. Secondary team would be on the way to rescue the 3 survivors, but they would still have to stay that night. So they decided to stay the night in the same tent, huddling together listening to a blizzard pick up and batter the sides of their tent. At one point, they were woken up by what sounded like hushed voices, nearly indistinguishable against the sharp wind, garbled and strange when they thought they could make it out from the wind. Eventually, it stopped and David was able to fall asleep. Couldn't have been more than a couple hours before Maggie was shaking him awake. It was morning, but Craig was gone. She couldn't find him anywhere. David rushed out of their tent to see everything in their camp, the rest of the tents and all their equipment completely destroyed in tattered ruins. Something had come sniffing through our camp, and it hadn't stopped looking until it found what it wanted. Maggie asked David if he thought it could have been a bear. With the ice shelf melting, they were coming further and further inland every year, and there's been more than a few. It was stopped by David reaching down and picking something up off the ground, a bloody piece of rough-hewn twine rope. Just like what they had seen on the pinafore, just like what they found in the workshop. Tracks led away from the rope and towards the pinafore, hundreds of yards away from the camp. David and Maggie, hesitant but not wanting to accept the death of another one of their teammates, followed. Halfway to the pinafore, as David and Maggie cautiously made their way, they were stopped dead in their tracks. A box, gift-wrapped, had been left directly in the center of the path. Small footprints the size of a child's led from the present back to the pinafore. David bent down, retrieved the package, and opened a small tag, revealing meticulous cursive spelling. Old English for welcome, old friends. David simply pulled on the piece of twine that bound the brown paper to the box, and the whole thing unwrapped with ease, all 4 walls of the box falling one by one. Maggie shrieked, and David turned away to retch. The box contained Sebastian's eyeless, severed head. David and Maggie made their way aboard the cursed 16th century ship, calling out to their friend. Maybe he's in the hold where he's safe and warm. David offered this hollow suggestion, almost out of some vague social responsibility to not give up. To not give up on their friend who was now, considering the circumstances, almost certainly dead. As the two made their way into the ship's hold and around the revolting pile of intertwined corpses, their search was now silent, both of them now too afraid to bring any unwanted attention. They checked every room on the ship, every hold, every cupboard, before converging on the captain's quarters. Inside lay Craig's clothes in a neat pile. Maggie cried out for Craig, rushing forwards into the quarters. But just before David moved to join her, he noticed a flicker of movement which gave him the slightest pause, and in his moment of hesitation, the door slammed, sealing Maggie away from David. By the time I reached the door, a distance that was barely 2 meters, she was screaming in unspeakable pain. It was a gibbering howl of terror and agony that filled me with such horror. I could feel the corners of my vision blur and turn black. Although his heart wanted more than anything to slam into the door with all his might and try to save Maggie, his body had different plans, turning and stumbling away from the door and whatever foul thing was terrorizing Maggie, and a bizarre plan formed in David's head. As repulsive as the pile of corpses was, it was big enough to allow entry in some places. David sprinted towards the bizarre effigy, throwing himself to the ground near a small nook barely big enough to fit a person inside. He laid on his stomach and started inching backwards towards the effigy, sliding underneath and in between the ice-cold bodies. The feel of frozen stumps prodding into his back and his legs, a finger snapping off and resting on the nape of his neck. He covered and hid himself in the pile as best as he could and laid there, suddenly realizing that the ship had fallen under a deafening silence. A wave of guilt and shame washed over him, the weight of his decision to flee from Maggie suddenly almost too heavy to bear. By the time his adrenaline began to subside, he wondered, has it been seconds, minutes, hours? Before he could fully get his grip back on reality, something sounded from the corridor, and he heard that terrible squeal from the captain's door opening. Awful voices spoke in what sounded like some kind of harsh, ancient, Germanic, Old English dialect. His eyes peeking through the various frozen body parts that camouflaged him, he finally caught a glimpse of their foe. All he knew was it wasn't human. He had never seen anything like them. I believe there was 2 or 3 of them, short, stocky, humanoid monstrosities. As he struggled to get a better look, Maggie was suddenly slammed onto the wooden deck in front of him, directly in his sightline, glaring at him in abject horror. Gagged with straw, her eyes freshly and brutally carved out. Unlike Sebastian, she was still sweating and shivering from the excruciating pain, no doubt. And although it should have been impossible, David couldn't help but feel like she was staring at him, like she knew he was there. She began thrashing against her restraints, which seemed to amuse her captors. One of them, laughing, leaned over and stuck a red bow on her forehead, again right in front of David, as they both bellowed laughter echoing off the ship's frozen hold. They muttered something in their strange language to each other, retrieved their latest victim, and began hauling her towards the trapdoor that led off of the ship. David remained right where he was, a new addition to this cruel effigy, part of this human Christmas tree for 2 days. When the secondary team finally arrived to rescue him, he had hypothermia, and the ancient frozen skin of the bodies there long before him had begun to fuse to its own. He had to be ripped away, and he lost 2 fingers from each hand. His story about what had happened was not accepted. The official story became that Sebastian had gone looking for this second anomaly and had gotten lost. The second anomaly being corrected in the record as a satellite glitch, or non-existent. And without their guide, the rest of the team suffered from hypothermia and severe delusions. The blood-soaked snow and the lack of any survivors obviously didn't look great for David, causing a lot of nasty rumors about and suspicion of David amongst his academic peers, which would ultimately lose him his job at the university. David had, for good reason, stopped celebrating Christmas, now having a dark inkling of what the myth of Santa and his elves may have been based off of in reality. A few years after his rescue from the first expedition, he received a gift. A small plain-wrapped box with that familiar rough-hewn twine and a neat bow. He opened it cautiously to reveal one of his lost fingers, left behind in his frozen tomb. The tag read in that ornate Old English cursive, "You left this, old friend." So that was the story. Now that we've kind of gone through it, let's go back and analyze some of what just happened. Starting with the ending, naturally. David details the fact that his story was met with much indignation and suspicion. Basically, he was ignored and seemingly almost blamed. The second anomaly or workshop was written off as a fluke or glitch of the satellite report. However, we know with this detail and some of the other details in the story that someone had much more information about that. A good story always leaves you with questions, but I would have loved to know a little bit more about just who was monitoring the team from base camp. For example, we know the team confirmed the GPS location of the second anomaly or workshop when they arrived looking for Sebastian. Multiple times in the story, our protagonists communicate with base camp about some of the abnormalities and horrifying things they were discovering, and just overall terrifying circumstances they were dealing with. The base camp seems to be utilizing some pretty advanced drone technology to monitor the team, taxi supplies. Maggie even talks about, I don't know if she actually did it or not, sending a biological sample using one of the drones back to the base camp. The base camp kind of seems like it never reacts until receiving word that Sebastian is in fact dead and the team wants an extract. Not arriving until pretty much everyone was dead and everything had gone radio silent for a few days. I also find it interesting that at one point in the story, the members of the team become paranoid, unsure of each other's loyalty. They all seem to have been sent by the university, but it seems as though only Craig and David share any kind of familiarity from before the expedition. I believe I failed to mention that the initial funding of the expedition is interesting. I'd spent years postulating that it was still frozen in the ice, just like the infamous ghost ship, the HMS Terror, a comparison I happily played up after the success of the fictional novel and TV show based on the lost Franklin expedition. One wealthy benefactor later, and I was equipped with more money than my whole department had seen in years, along with the testy but experienced guide, Sebastian. And somehow, against all odds, we found it after a brutal 7-day hike. So one benefactor provided more funding than his entire department had seen for years. The money didn't come from the university, and neither did Sebastian. Isn't it interesting that Sebastian alone made the initial trek to the second anomaly? Also, although we may chalk it up to not being detailed in the story for brevity's sake, it doesn't really seem as though David should have any idea of where the ship would actually be located. The Arctic is a massive, mostly unpopulated and unmapped wild tundra. Is it possible that this wealthy benefactor, and maybe even Sebastian, knew the likely location of the ship and workshop, and allowed David and his team to feel as though they were making this discovery and lead the charge, in order to make contact with, research, or even recover something from this mythical workshop? Maybe this benefactor had a bone to pick with old Jolly St. Nick. Maybe a naughty little rich boy got coal in his stocking one too many times and never got over it. I find it interesting, if not a little frustrating, that there are so many references to toys and the kind of unseen foes being small or elf-like, and just Christmas in general, but we never get a solid look or even much of a description about them. Not to mention any glimpse or physical reference to Papa Noel himself. Someone in the comment section of the original post on the No Sleep subreddit pondered whether or not Santa Claus may have been long dead. The horrors detailed in the story were committed by the descendants of Santa's elves, now making toys and trinkets from the bodies of anyone unfortunate enough to wander into the workshop. Others suggested that these weren't Santa's little helpers at all, but minions of his dark counterpart, Krampus. So what do you think was really going on behind the story? Let me know in the comments down below, which will also help me please the algorithm gods. I love you all. Like and subscribe. Max Powers, YouTube, ParasykeTV.